There is something that is emerging as an undeniable feature of modern governments. They exist not to serve the people of any country, but to serve the interests of those who use governments to profit at the expense of their victims. Thanks in large part to the advent of the internet, we, as a species, seem to be reaching a critical mass of awareness of this as the hive mind grows stronger, more pervasive, and better connected. Tragically, the acts of defiance born from this awareness reveal another undeniable feature of modern governance. They are inherently violent. Part of the development of humanity is the evolution of society away from systems of violence and force to systems of peaceful cooperation and true freedom. Modern governments are now not just holding us back by keeping us locked into systems based on coercion and central planning, but they are now all over the world violently impeding our ability to move humanity forward. So on behalf of the people of the world who are standing up for freedom and those who wish to stand with us, I hereby declare war on our governments. In this war, there may be justified violence and self-defense, but we the people will win this war, and we will do it without firing a shot. This is a truth war because modern governments only exist with deception, and the big lie of modern government is that we need it, that we could not possibly address the big issues of life without giving up a piece of our autonomy, that we can give up on peaceful cooperation. Well, we can't, and we won't. And the promise of the internet is that we will use it to render the necessary evil of government unnecessary by discovering ways to achieve all of the things we have been convinced we need government for, with the free trade of ideas, passions, and of course, goods and services. But how did we get here? As we have evolved and come to rely more on our brain power than our physical strength for survival, the natural advantage of men over women has diminished. One of the exciting things we have to look forward to is the continuation of that trend, and we also will evolve to more universally condemn freedom-violating acts of aggression. The modern feminist movement actually got its start in France. But the first country, technically still a colony at the time, to give women the vote was New Zealand in 1893. But it wasn't until 1913 that the government of the United States gave women voting privileges. And not until 1979 that the UN adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now, I'm not trying to come up with a complete narrative here of how we got to this point in history, but the elevation of women in society is, in my humble opinion, the single most important trend. There were certainly some other interesting events along the way. In Russia, there was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, although it could be argued that that was more the institution of a modern government to replace an autocracy, but significant nonetheless. In India, during the Indian independence movement, Gandhi pioneered mass civil disobedience, as with the famous March to the Sea, to make salt in defiance of the British colonists. After decades of struggle, the Republic of India finally came into its own on the 26th of January, 1950. Now, you might not think of World War II as essential to the lead up to World War III, but as World War I was essential to pissing off Germans, with economic sanctions and crippling debt following the war, so was the initiation of World War II by those governments, Germany, Japan, and Italy, who took the idea of governance to its logical conclusion, essential to creating the governmental systems that people are fighting today. And World War II, as President Eisenhower pointed out, was responsible for the birth of our own military-industrial complex. Right. But first, there was the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. But soon enough, American politicians were able to go back to ignoring the people, as in the lead-up to the war in Iraq in 2003, when millions of people marched throughout the world in protest of the U.S.-led liberation, but it didn't stop the war from happening. So what about now? And I don't reasonably think that I'd be able to capture the current recent wave of protests that we're seeing of a new nature, a new kind of challenge to authority throughout the world, but many see what we're seeing today, this current wave, as starting in Tunisia, where a street vendor set himself on fire in protest and sparked the ousting of Ben Ali. This was followed by massive protests throughout the Middle East, most notably in Yemen and Bahrain, but culminating in Egypt, with the drawn-out replacement of 30-year President Hosni Mubarak with the military he once commanded. In Syria, It seemed the Arab Spring stalled as President Assad has now gotten away with a brutal crackdown on protests that has led to thousands of deaths while shutting out foreign media, with most governments turning a blind eye until just recently. In Libya, the unrest turned into full-scale military confrontations when NATO got behind the rebel forces working to oust Colonel Gaddafi, and now far more have died there than even Assad has managed to kill in Syria. And despite NATO looking silly with Gaddafi still in power, the bombs keep falling. The country is in kind of a stalemate. And in a very underreported story, 250,000 Israelis, inspired by their Arab neighbors, took to the streets last weekend to protest a high cost of living, poor public services, and one of the highest income gaps in the developed world. But in China, there have also been a lot of incidents lately. In a little parallel with Tunisia, a group of police were beaten up by bystanders who witnessed them roughing up a pregnant 20-year-old street vendor. This sparked riots that would put London to shame, and even according to state media, there are tens of thousands of incidents every year in China. But their wave may have deeper roots. Now, most Americans think of Tiananmen Square as that protest where the guy stood in front of the tank. Well, this was part of something much bigger that involved hundreds of thousands of protesters and a military crackdown that led to anywhere from hundreds to thousands of deaths. And in Chile, right now, there are widespread student protests involving hundreds of thousands. In Sudan, the recent split and formation of South Sudan recently reminded the world that government borders are arbitrary and subject to change at the will of the people. While in Iceland, in the recent banking crisis in which they allowed their 3 major commercial banks to fail, they reminded us that there is no such thing as too big to fail, only too big to be sustained. And while there have been protests throughout Europe recently, the protests over proposed austerity measures in Greece have been the most desperate mix of demanding that government handouts continue and that payoffs to the banksters cease. In France, where there is a strong tradition of liberal protest, there's also a very low threshold for protesting, and not only was the country practically shut down for 3 weeks of riots in 2005, this was the birthplace of modern feminism. Whereas here in the United States, when unions in Wisconsin had their collective bargaining deals threatened, they held Tahrir copycat protests. But here, they weren't challenging the government as much as protesting to demand the force of government be used against the rest of the population in order to take care of them in the unions. One of the major lead-ups, or warning shots, if you will, of World War III was the WikiLeaks release of the Bradley Manning data. Founder and head of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, is currently on house arrest in London, where there are street riots happening as we speak, and Bradley Manning is still being held at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We're still experiencing the fallout from his massive dump of government data, and WikiLeaks continues to be an important vehicle for leakers to get data out to the public. Now, while it was the street vendor setting himself on fire in Tunisia that sparked protests that launched the Arab Spring, some give credit to WikiLeaks for pulling the curtain back on bigger problems and making this kind of unrest possible. The protests spread and seemed to culminate with the toppling of another regime in Egypt. While seeing Mubarak go was widely hailed as a victory throughout the Middle East against a dictator empowered primarily by U.S. military aid, the actual change in governance in Egypt seems to be more incremental than revolutionary, where now they seem to be discovering that the new boss acts a lot like the old boss. But don't worry, we'll all get over the whole having a boss idea soon enough. Coming to the defense of WikiLeaks is a new kind of political player, Anonymous. And while Anonymous has been reported as a group or collective of hackers, hacktivists, and miscreants, it is neither a group or a collective even, but merely an idea, or rather a stream of ideas born from the anonymous underbelly of the internet. Those who have taken up the banner of Anonymous, often identified by the infamous Guy Fawkes mask as inspired by the movie V for Vendetta, have already had a major impact in the war against government.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message. I love you. Now, back to our show.
What I have just presented is hardly sufficient to tell the story of how humanity got to this point in history and comes from an admittedly American-centric perspective, but we all bring our own stories to the front lines as well as our own demands for the future. We are united only in our common humanity. That innate desire to be free and live in peace that we share brings us together. So the people on the front lines of World War III might not have a common vision, but we have a common enemy. The enemy is government itself. The enemy is the idea that humans can be justified in controlling each other by by force. The enemy is the man. As Albert Einstein famously said, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Well, we now know that what weapons World War III will be fought with, and thanks to the people of the world realizing that the real war is with government itself, not with huge numbers of people that just so happen to live within another arbitrary border drawn by another government, we won't be seeing any countries allowing their governments to kill huge numbers of people with weapons like the atom bombs that Einstein helped develop. At least we can hope. Thanks to viral videos, no longer can state agents mindlessly beat and kill people who bring forth grievances. At least, not get away with it so easily. So now they have to get creative. Enter the latest in non-lethal solutions. We present to you the weapons of World War III. First up, rather, the enemy's weapons. The Active Denial System, or ADS.
The Active Denial System, or ADS. It's designed to incapacitate enemy combatants with an unnerving, non-lethal sensation of intense heat. Watch as the ray silently strikes and scatters the crowd.
Next up is the Personal Halting and Stimulation Response Rifle, or as the acronym which gave it the name clearly demonstrates, the phaser is a device capable of temporarily blinding crowds with a low-intensity laser, or as the U.S. Air Force factually describes it, quote, "The laser light from phaser temporarily impairs aggressors by dazzling them with one wavelength. The second wavelength causes a repel effect that discourages advancing aggressors." And for the latest in taser technology, no, this isn't from a video game. This is a real-life 12-gauge taser shotgun. The blue shirts in Albuquerque are already packing electricity with these things. The Taser X12 rifle fires taser projectile rounds with a range of up to 100 feet. They're currently working on a semi-automatic version capable of firing up to 5 rounds in 2 seconds, in case several hundred deaths in the U.S. alone already wasn't enough to demonstrate that tasers are not exactly less than lethal. And what would a war be without a few chemical compounds? The problem has always been how to most effectively disperse them. But the Pentagon is developing a method of dispersal for advanced riot control agents, such as tear gas or even opiates. One toy they're working on is the XM-1063 non-lethal personnel suppression projectile, which, similar to conventional anti-personnel artillery rounds, is capable of detonating or releasing a payload in midair over targets. But this one can do 152 canisters of a compound over a 100,000 square foot area. Next up, the Mob XS deterrent using silent audio, or Medusa. They don't even try to hide the nefarious intentions with these names anymore. This is in development still under the Navy. Basically, it uses a beam of short microwave pulses to burn tissue inside the skull. It might also cause brain damage, but it's not lethal, right? Finally, we have the long-range acoustic device, or LRAD. Yeah. Whew. Here it is at the G20 in Pittsburgh. And yeah, that's enough of that. Can we? Okay, thank you. All right, all of these look pretty exciting. Maybe some are not exactly less than lethal, but at least none of them can bomb us back to the Stone Age. Before we get to see all the latest status toys in action, though, the news department here considered doing a segment with a few test demonstrations, and I volunteered to be the guinea pig. As I've somehow so far evaded any tasings from the blue-shirted micro-tyrants, I might have to let the news team here at RT do the honors. I'm pretty sure we can get a hold of one of those shotguns, but we'll have to see about the Medusa. You're watching Adam versus the Man. We'll be right back.